Once it has become established that the government of this country is prepared to negotiate with kidnappers, to break the laws of the country, to release convicted criminals, to hand out huge sums of money, to publish the name of informers, then of course we would, in all probability, have more kidnappings and more blackmail until the day would undoubtedly come when the government would have to call a halt. And the moment it called a halt, then of course it would be under criticism that it had acceded to the demands in order to secure the release of some people and was now refusing to accede to the demands to release other persons. And therefore, we have supported the government because we believe that to allow any group to dictate terms to the democratic elected government of this country is to invite anarchy and chaos in Canada. I think that Canadians must become aware of the fact that there are revolutionary forces in the world, and now unfortunately some in Canada, who are dedicated to the use of violence to bring about social change. We in the New Democratic Party want to bring about social change. But we have always believed that the means that are used determine the ends that are attained. Those who attain power by violence and force always have to retain power by violence and force. And the government that is founded on violence and force then begins to have problems within its own ranks, and the transfer of power and the change of leadership is also settled by violence and force. And when we start down that road, Mr. Speaker, we are inviting the man on horseback. And the experience of history from the days of Napoleon to Stalin to Hitler have all proven the same thing, that social change that is predicated on violence and on sabotage and on kidnapping and assassination is bound to end up in a police state with periodic purges. We do not accept the doctrine of the Mao that all power proceeds out of the mouth of a gun. Because when we accept that concept, what we are saying is that society will be dominated by those who have the most guns and the ruthless will to use them. In a country that hasn't got the democratic process, one can understand men who desire freedom resorting to force. But in a country which has a democratic process and which has form of parliamentary democracy, we say that these are the means at hand to bring about social change, and these are the means we're going to do. The second thing on which we have supported the government is its desire to do everything possible to secure the release of Mr. Cross and Mr. Laporte. We, of course, understood that they could not possibly negotiate on the terms that of the demands that had been made, but the government has a responsibility to negotiate, if possible, the safe return of these two men to their anguished families. For that reason, we have done everything we could not to make a delicate situation more difficult, in order that if the government could possibly reach some agreement for the release of these men without acceding to the demands which had been made, then they should be given every opportunity to do so. But now, Mr. Speaker, we come to point at which we cannot support the government. The government is now convinced that there is a state of civil disturbance and anticipated sabotage, which requires prompt and vigorous action. And the government, of course, is in possession, undoubtedly, of information which is not available to us. But I suggest that if the government has information that civil disturbances are likely to break out on a large scale, that sabotage is anticipated in menacing proportions, then the government, of course, has a responsibility to deal with that. And I submit that properly the government had two options in dealing with that. The first was to deal with it under the powers which they now have under the laws of Canada. To utilize all the powers under the treason clauses in the criminal code, the clauses dealing with seditious intention. And there are very considerable powers there. And I think the government deserves some criticism that some of those clauses have not been used, because there have been indications of seditious intent upon which the government could have acted. And also there is a provision dealing with the matter of offensive weapons, and the government could have acted under that provision. The government had the power to call in the armed forces and did so. And there was no criticism of the government for using these extraordinary powers if they, in their opinion, on the basis of the information which they and they alone had, considered that the situation was serious enough to warrant such action. The second option which was open to the government was that if they came to the conclusion that the powers they now enjoy under the criminal code and under various statutes was not sufficient to cope with this situation, the magnitude of which the rest of us are not fully aware, then the government had the option of coming before Parliament and asking Parliament in a democratic way to clothe them with the authority to deal with this unusual situation. Certainly I can say, as far as this party is concerned, that we would have been prepared to facilitate very quickly such matters coming before Parliament, in order that the government might be able to indicate the areas in which it hadn't sufficient power and the justification for requiring greater powers and greater authority. But the government hasn't utilized this option. Instead, the government has taken the unusual step of invoking the War Measures Act. In my opinion, the government has overreacted to what is undoubtedly a critical situation. Does civil disturbance constitute